Okay, we're into our fifth video now on memory and intelligence. Um, so far up to this point, you should be hopefully have gotten through the with all the videos and doing stuff, the activities in class, and we're been watching the videos in there and going through all of that. Also, you do have the worksheet assignment that you've been working on, and to be getting that done. Um, and then also we'll be taking a quiz here pretty soon as well. The last part now on memory, chapter 7, that we're going to get into, and hopefully you've been keeping up on the reading and everything that's entailed in that. But we've gone through two now of the three key processes when it deals with memory. We have talked about and outlined very thoroughly how does information get into our brain in the first place in order for us to create a memory, and that is called encoding. And we went through that process pretty thoroughly. The second part that we've gone through now, and we just finished up with the last video, is how do you hold, how do you maintain that information? And that is dealing with the concept of storage. And we outlined over that pretty thoroughly as well. So we've got two of the three done now when it comes to the memory system. The last one that we're going to get into today is the concept of retrieval, and how do you get the information back out again. When it comes to retrieval and pulling that information out, remember what we talked about. When you build a memory, that memory gets into your hippocampus, and then it is broken up and sent out across your brain. Then your brain has to recollect all that information back together again in your hippocampal region in order for you to rebuild that memory. When you try to do that, there are many times things kind of go wrong. And three of the most common problems when it comes to retrieval of information to get it with your memory are dealing with what's called tip of the tongue phenomenon, misinformation effect, and source monitoring effect. The first one, tip of the tongue phenomenon, you probably heard of it before. We've kind of talked about it before. It's a theory of Freud's that comes out and those kind of things. Basically what it is, it's the inability to remember something that you know, and is accompanied by the feeling that it's just out of reach. Now the key word here is no. Okay, if you have the inability to remember something and it's because you just never learned it in the first place, it never got into your brain, it never made it into the memory system, well, that's not tip of the tongue. That's just paying no attention and just don't knowing it. Okay, tip of the tongue is where you have it. It's in your memory. You built that memory system for it. You just cannot pull it out right now. It's that marble at the very bottom of the barrel, and you can't get it out of there. Most people on average, they say it happens about once a week. I believe it happens more than that. For me, I have tip of the tongue phenomenon a lot, especially when it comes to people's names. I have a horrible time memorizing people's names, and that's because I don't pay attention very well to it. I will get introduced to somebody, they will tell me their name, I will try to remember it, I will try to build it into my memory system, but inevitably I'm horrible when it comes to names. So what I've had to learn to do is I've had to learn to come up with a retrieval cue, some little trick, kind of like what we talked about with encoding there with the Mr. Dave thing, to try to remember it. So what I try to do then is when I meet somebody for the first time, I will try to find a physical feature about them, something about their personality, something about them as a person that I can connect with somebody that I already know, and I can make that connection. Now, if their name happens to be the same with somebody else's, then I can make that connection a lot easier. That way, I can pull that information out so much easier. Because remember, we talked about when it comes to long-term memory, you have that schematic network in which things are connected together. So if I can remember the person that I already know, that will help pull or retrieve that information that I'm just beginning to learn of this new person's name. So that's a little trick that you can use to try to start to remember things better, is by making those connections and building those associations. And we talked about that way back with the very beginning of the unit. The second thing you can learn to do is to try to put yourself back in the situation of the information that you're trying to retrieve in the first place. So, for example, when you're going to be taking this test here pretty soon, and you're sitting over there in the lecture hall across over at the Math and Science building, and you can't remember an answer to a question, you could try to put yourself back into where you were when you were listening to the videos and getting this information in the first place, and try to be able to pick that information up by being able to get placing yourself back at that time. The third way is trying to retrace your steps right directly, physically. And a lot of times you can do that like when you lose your keys or lose your cell phone or something like that. You walk backwards. Well, okay, I was in this room. So you go back to that room and you figure out what you were doing in there and you look at the items in the room, and that helps spark new memories of possibly what you did with your phone or your keys. And next thing you know, eventually you find them. That is another way that our brains work. A second problem that we get into with with retrieval is misinformation effect. Oftentimes, remember, when we're building our memory, okay, when we're recollecting that information in our hippocampal region to rebuild the memory back, our brains are not able to pull back all of the information. So what happens is our brains will ad lib. It will pull other information in that will kind of add to the story or to add to whatever it is you're trying to bring back into your memory system. Not always is it the same facts, and that's why sometimes what we think is the absolute truth of something we're saying is not, and we could be giving misleading information. There's a big difference between that and lying. Lying is a willful, knowledgeable effect that you are saying something not true. Misinformation effect is when, to the best of your ability, you are telling the truth and you are giving the information out. You just don't know that some of the information you're giving may not be correct. The third way that we have a problem retrieving information from our brain is source monitoring. That is where we actually know the information, we present it, but we cannot remember where the information comes from, the origin of it. And that's because we focus so intently on what it was that was being said or what we saw, we forgot where we saw or heard it at. And this oftentimes can, again, cause problems when you're trying to relay that information back to somebody. Okay, when it comes to forgetting, why do we forget? Well, the biggest, most easiest reason why do we forget? Ineffective encoding. We just good old don't focus and pay attention. Our minds are somewhere else. We're drifting in and out, and we just aren't able to collect the information in the first place, called pseudo forgetting. A lot of times students will say, oh, Mr. R, I should have done better on that test. I should have studied harder. I thought I knew the information. Well, in actuality, it was pseudo forgetting. For most likely, you just weren't even focusing or paying attention in the first place. Especially if we're sitting in class and you got your head down, or if you don't show up to class, or if you don't listen to the videos, you're not going to get this stuff. It's that simple. It really is that pretty easy. It's ineffective encoding. You can say that you got it or think you got it, but you don't. You never put it into your memory in the first place. The second reason why do we forget? Decay. Now, decay is we focused, we built the information, we got it in our brain, we just wasn't able to get it into that long-term memory. Decay is a forgetting that occurs over time. Now, there is some theories out there, remember, when it comes to long-term memory that says that yes, you can lose your long-term memories through decay. So decay is not just a short-term memory loss of information. Some psychologists believe it is also a long-term loss of information. But for the most part, it happens because of the fact that we get so much information coming in, the complexity of it is so high, and the types of information that you're trying to learn can become a problem that you aren't able to keep it in there. And so over time, because we don't reuse it or we don't rehearse it and repeat it over and over, we could lose it. The third reason why do we forget? Interference. Now this goes to short-term memory. Interference is basically because competition of other material. There are two types of interference that can cause us a lot of problems. Let's say right now as you're listening to this video and you're trying to get this information down and trying to get it put in, the fact is that you get done watching this and okay, I got this information, and then you pull out your math book and you start reading your math problems, or maybe you go start working on English. That new information coming in now to your brain, because you have not been able to move this stuff that in psychology into your long-term memory, you haven't been able to move it there yet. This new information is going to basically block out the previously learned information. And this happens a lot, we got new information coming into our brains all the time. So it's really hard for us to remember things sometimes. We could be sitting there trying really hard, and then somebody comes in and they start talking to you. Boom. You just lost that information because of retro interference. Proactive is basically where previously learned information interferes with new. So you go get a new cell phone number, and basically every time you go out to give your cell phone number to somebody, you're giving them the old number because that old number interferes with the knowledge of the new number then. Proactive isn't as much of a type of interference as retroactive, but it's still a problem. Number 4. The fourth reason why, retrieval failure. Now, we've talked a lot about this one already, so I'm not going to go back over it very much. But basically, it's just that idea where you have the inability to match the cues with the encoded information. It can happen a lot of reasons why, but retrieval failure is oftentimes something that gets into because of the fact that that information maybe is something that's a little bit older, that we don't have much use for, and it's harder for us to get it pulled out, or because it's so similar to other information that it's hard to make that connection to. The last reason why do we forget is what's called motivated forgetting. Now, this is the one that's a big controversy. Motivated forgetting is the repression of distressing thoughts and feelings buried deep inside. Motivated means that you want to forget, you strive to forget, you push yourself to forget. Can you actually force yourself to forget something that you don't want to remember? For example, if you were raped, if you had saw some brutalization in war, or maybe you saw someone die, those kind of things for women could do. Why is it that for a lot of women they think they remember their birth of their child, as they're pregnant and the mom's giving birth? Many times, though, women actually are blocked. One of the things that happens to pregnant mothers when they're giving birth is actually there's a hormone that blocks, suppresses the pain so that they don't remember as much of the pain from the birth. And that's why a lot of women then don't think that the birth was as bad or as painful as what it could have been, is because they're able to have that blocked. But the key is, again, can we actually totally repress a memory that we never forget, that never remember it? And then years later, you hear about these stories of these people that, when they were a small child, were maybe molested, and then all of a sudden they turn in their 30s, and they have these memories come back to them. Is that a possibility? For the most part, a lot of psychologists say no. Other psychologists say yes. So it's a very controversial uh, argument about whether or not this actually works. Up in Ontario, Canada, and I don't remember the year right offhand, but over almost 10,000 residents were surveyed, and they were done on this study that was done. 13% of the females, 4% of the males came back and reported that after they had done this survey, they had all of a sudden had these repressed memories come back to them of actually being abused as a child. Well, statistically, that's an incredibly high number. You're talking of almost 10,000 residents, close to almost 1,300 that would be reporting this of females. That's a pretty high number. To have that happen to them would be pretty exceptional. So the question was, did they actually have these repressed memories, or is it more likely that there was some memories put into their mind that could have triggered or thought that they had this? And this is where it gets into this whole argument. A lot of times when it comes to trying to gain knowledge about this thing, instead of the fact that we're not saying that these people are lying, that they're reporting that they had sexual abuse, but there is more of this concept about persuasive therapists. Now, we're going to get into a lot more about this when we get into class, so I'm not going to kind of get too much more into it, but it is a very controversial issue. It is a very tough issue because there are people out there who really believe that they have been abused or they had some traumatic event happen to them that they basically blocked out of their memory, and now it's come back to them over the years because of different things that has happened to them. Could it be true? Could it not be true? Is it false memories? Is it real memory? This is be something we're going to talk a little bit about, and we'll watch a video about this too when we get back into class. But for right now, just keep in mind that it is a theory, and it is one of the theories about how and why do we forget things then. Okay, the last way that we do forget things is because of not that we didn't learn it, or we didn't want to learn it, or we can't remember it, or we can't retrieve it. It's because it was destroyed. And that is going to the anatomy of memory itself. And the two ways that basically our memories can be wiped out is through amnesia and Alzheimer's. There's two types of amnesia. There's retro and anterograde amnesia. Retrograde's the one you hear about. It's the one you see movies about. It's the one that's mostly predominantly people focus on. That is when you get hit in the head and all of a sudden, maybe you get knocked unconscious, you wake up and someone asks you how you are and you say fine, and then you can't remember things that had happened to you prior to the injury. So you don't remember anything about getting hit. You don't remember anything about the 2 days or 3 days before that. Now, can you get total amnesia, like wipe out your entire brain? No. That's a name for a movie, but it's a movie. In actuality, no. Anterograde amnesia, this is the one that's more severe. This is the one we got to be more careful of. But most times parents and coaches and the rest of us don't focus on this one. This is the one where you get hit in the head. You act totally fine. You can count to 3. You can count backwards. You can say the alphabet. You can say your name, all that stuff. Coach thinks you're fine. He puts you back in the game. You play. Everything's fine. 2, 3 days later, you start complaining about a headache, and everyone kind of puts it off. No big deal. You start getting kind of wobbly and woozy. You start getting more headaches. You start to feel nausea in your stomach. Next thing you know, next day you collapse on the ground and you go into a coma. It's called anterograde amnesia. Basically, the injury has occurred in your brain, but it's a slow bleed, which is slowly destroying parts of your brain cells because of the hemorrhaging that's going on there. And it's slowly destroying your ability to not just maintain memory, but also to maintain your life support. And this is a very dangerous type of amnesia because you can't usually trigger it right away. And a lot of times we don't think too much of it because most of the time we're focusing on this one rather than this one. An example was HM. He had surgery to remove part of his hippocampal region. He had the inability to create long-term memories from it. So again, doing damage to your brain can have a long-term permanent effect on either your long-term or short-term memory, depending upon what part of the brain gets removed or gets damaged because of that. Alzheimer's is also a way that can destroy your brain, and this is something they're studying quite a bit about. For some reason, it predominantly attacks the hippocampal region, which is where we consolidate those memories at. Okay, this finishes up lesson number 6, presentation number 6, and then we're going to get into cognition and intelligence, which is chapter 8, on your next presentation. So we'll stop here, and we'll get back in class and do some activities then.